What do you do when you have to teach tough historical topics? Now, a while back, I made a video on this topic, and I'll go ahead and link it down below for you to watch. But with the changing panorama, the constant criticism and paranoia we live in today, it's next to nearly impossible not to feel nervous when teaching topics that you feel might be scrutinized or criticized. If you're excited to learn how you can tackle tough history topics in your history class, I would appreciate if you hit the like button so that this video can be seen by other teachers who may be struggling in figuring out how to approach this predicament. And if you're new to this channel, hello historians, I'm Cecilia Tamez, and I'm an educator support specialist, and I help overwhelmed and overworked history teachers become confident facilitators of student-led and student-centered classrooms. So the first strategy in teaching tough history topics is to do your homework. What topics are currently or have always been hotly contested topics? So religion, race, sexuality, gender, social class division, social justice, immigration, just to name a few. When we identify where we're going to be challenged as teachers, we have more time to prepare and be intentional about how we're going to teach and how to support our approach in how we teach the content. Now, the next strategy for teaching tough history topics may not be so popular, but when sitting in the hot seat, we'll be grateful for them. And yes, we hate them, but they're good documentation if done correctly. And of course, I'm talking about lesson plans. Documenting the resources we used and the way we teach is always good to have should parents or administrators come in to question our approach. Aside from this, it's also very helpful to know your standards like the back of your hand. If you can validate your lesson with a required curriculum standard, it lends more weight and validity to your lesson. Another tip for teaching hard history topics is knowing how to teach in an unbiased way. And this one's really complex because let me give you a hint. We all have bias. Every history resource you bring into your classroom will have a bias. Why? Because the values held by historians or even eyewitnesses will determine and influence how they retell or remember a historical event. However, we can be equitable in presenting voices from all the parties involved. Now, unfortunately, certain challenges have arisen from this, and that is non-historians, politicians, administrators, parents, even teachers have taken this literally, even suggesting things like incorporating Nazi literature for the sake of saying that they're unbiased and evaluating all perspectives. The other challenge here is that even when we do attempt to be equitable, this has been perceived as a corruption of the historical record and indoctrination simply because we are providing students the opportunity and the access to all perspectives. With that example, in practice, historically speaking, you could read excerpts of Nazi literature, but not for the sake of amplifying its ideologies or just to cover your butt and say you're being unbiased. Rather, it can be used to possibly create context for the disturbing, unscientific, and unfounded claims that caused the mass murder of an entire people. So actual historians do read and evaluate everything because, of course, in order for us to prevent more ethnic and racially motivated genocide in this case, we need to know the extent of the ideologies and the context that could breed such tragedy and therefore prevent it in the future. I want to make perfectly clear that there is a difference in showcasing all sources just to prove we're being unbiased and showcasing sources that create context to amplify the voices of those who were originally silenced in the historical narrative. So for example, when teaching Reconstruction as a primary source, my class may read an early recruitment pamphlet of the Ku Klux Klan from, 1867. Then we read and evaluate sources by eyewitnesses that experience violence and harassment at the hands of this terrorist organization and determine whether they were truly defenders of the Constitution and Christianity, if they were committing crimes and blocking the exercise of constitutional rights. This allows students to evaluate the discrepancy between words and actions and helps them to understand that not every primary source, even dominant narratives can't always be trusted to give us the full picture of what really happened. When students understand this, I feel like they'll be more open to listening to other perspectives, and in this case, create context for the Black perspectives that for years were silenced. Now, when teaching tough history topics, you also want to grease the wheels with the parents. What does this mean? During open house, you can share your state's curriculum, what students are expected to learn and master, what kind of questions will be asked of them, the depth at which they'll be expected to know content, and also skills that they need to master. If you show yourself to be a knowledgeable authority in what students need to know, you're less likely to be questioned because it'll be understood that you're designing lessons, exercises, activities, and questions that purposefully align to what students need to know. Now, I know planning intentionally is not always easy. Sometimes it can be so overwhelming and confusing and intimidating, especially if these are your first couple years teaching history. This is why a segment of my teacher training program, Teach Like an Influencer Academy, supports teachers in planning and facilitating aligned instruction so that you know that what you're planning and how you're teaching is the way the students will be able to demonstrate their mastery. If you want to know if this program can support you in your teaching journey, click the Teach Like an Influencer Academy link in the description below. Another necessary component of teaching tough history topics to your students is explaining the why. Oftentimes we jump straight into teaching controversial or contested topics, and then our students go home and tell their parents that they're being taught religion or race in school. So what does this mean? This means that students also need to know their learning outcomes. They need to know the skills, the types of questions that they'll be asked and expected to answer on certain topics. This is going to help justify why you're teaching what you're teaching. You always want to preview your lesson in explaining why you have to touch on this topic, what broader historical or idea it'll help your students understand. And then you also want to go into detail about how students will be assessed. Not only does this build trust with your learners, but it makes them feel confident that you know what you're talking about and that you know how to prepare them. But it also gives them context so they don't inadvertently throw you under the bus when in reality you're really doing nothing wrong. Now, when teaching tough history topics, stick to historical elements. Always ask how this topic played an integral part of a historical period, event, or story as you design your lesson. What are the basics that students need to understand in order for students to have sufficient historical context? Sometimes I feel like we go too in-depth on a topic that maybe we don't need to be elaborating on so much. And because we're doing some major unplanned historical off-roading, it'll be harder to justify should your methodology be questioned by a nitpicky parent. Now, this one's a little bit tricky, but it just takes practice. Deflect opinion questions of controversial topics back to your class. Now, we're not trying to gaslight our students and just ignore their questions. However, you can use these opportunities to present or explore various viewpoints that are being contested. So you might say, well, the government and the community frowns on teachers giving their own personal opinion, which is the truthful answer. But maybe after that, you can segue into explaining some of the dominant ideologies or arguments surrounding this topic, and then close by saying that you don't want to sway their opinion on this topic and would rather hear from them. Now, this next tip is very important for teaching tough historical topics, and that is using reputable sources. I think it's safe to say that we can all agree that our textbooks do not do a good job in addressing the curiosities, the questions that our students have, and overall just are outdated and have some serious shortcomings. Not too long ago, the New York Times actually wrote a really interesting article comparing textbooks, and you'll see for yourself that a lot of textbooks, they lack perspectives, they're outdated, and they are not equitable in the information and the perspectives that they share. So that means that most of us have potentially, and hopefully should have, supplemented our textbook with additional resources. To support the validity of our teaching, we need to ensure that those sources are reputable, well-known, well-respected, and that they are as equitable as possible in their approach. And if you know some good history books that are equitable and reputable, let me know in the comments below. Now, when teaching tough history topics, you also need to understand the laws in your state. Now, I'm no lawyer, so disclaimer, this is not legal advice, but it's unfortunate that so many states are using law to manipulate history, silence narratives, and really control how future generations will understand historical events. However, I feel like more often than not, these laws are being amplified and misrepresented by governing bodies. So governors, administrators, state representatives, school boards, even complaining parents, okay, to be more limiting than these laws actually intended. When carefully read, the provisions in some of these laws don't really eliminate certain topics from history classrooms. They just dictate how they should be taught. If they were truly eliminated by law, they wouldn't be showing up in our state curriculum and in our state assessments. So if this topic is still reflected in your state curriculum and in your state assessments, you are legally allowed and obligated to teach those topics, especially if it'll be tested. And sadly, when these laws are being misunderstood by governing bodies and parents, the law becomes transmuted into a prohibition of teaching a certain topic versus just a regulation about the approach. This next tip for teaching tough history is greatly underrated, but goes a long way in getting buy-in for your history teaching approach. And that is project confidence about how you teach. When you know in good faith that you are doing everything possible to create historical context for learners, giving them opportunities to reach conclusions, providing a variety of sources, and merely facilitating their discussions. When you have documentation and you know your lessons are aligned to state standards and learning outcomes, stand by your teaching. Now, if you need additional support or ideas for your history classroom, be sure to sign up for my history teacher help hotline in the description below and get support and exclusive content straight to your inbox. If you found this helpful, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you handle this sensitive issue in your classroom and any helpful tips that you're willing to share with historians down below. I want your success. I'm rooting for you. Until next time, class dismissed.